America's most decorated soldier of World War II, Audie Murphy. On a wooded mountain near Roanoke, Virginia this afternoon, rescue workers found 6 bodies and no survivors in the remains of a private plane the 46-year-old Murphy and a group of businessmen had taken in a flight from Atlanta, Georgia last Friday.
He was America's most decorated war hero, a Hollywood icon, and a voice for forgotten veterans. But in 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a plane and vanished into a fiery crash that made no sense. Not to his family, not to his friends, and not to those who knew what he was fighting behind closed doors. Official reports called it an accident, but the documents were redacted, the pilot's past was disturbing, and Murphy had just filed a government complaint against powerful people. He was being followed. He felt unsafe, and he told someone weeks before he died, "If anything happens," to me it wasn't just bad luck. In the parched farmlands of Kingston, Texas, a boy was born who would one day rise to become the most decorated combat soldier in American history. His name was Audie Leon Murphy. Born on June 20th, 1925, he was the 7th of 12 children in a sharecropping family that struggled to survive the Great Depression. Life was harsh. Food was scarce. Education was spotty. And hope was a luxury the Murphy family couldn't afford. Audie's father, Emmett Murphy, was largely absent, leaving the burden of raising the children to Audie's mother, Josie. But Josie herself would pass away when Audie was just 16. That death changed everything. Already hardened by hunger and poverty, Audie quit school in 5th grade and took on multiple jobs to support his siblings. He picked cotton, worked in general stores, and hunted game just to get by. He was a child, yet already far more of a man than many grown-ups around him. That same year, war clouds loomed large across the world. In 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, young men everywhere enlisted with patriotic fire. Audie was among them. But he faced a problem: his age and his size. He was only 16 and looked even younger. The Navy and the Marines rejected him outright. But the Army, slightly less strict in its requirements, finally accepted him after he forged his birth certificate. In 1942, Audie Murphy became a U.S. Army infantryman. What no one could have predicted, least of all Audie himself, was how that decision would make him a legend. Assigned to the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, Murphy began training. He stood barely 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 110 pounds soaking wet. Initially, many officers doubted his ability to handle combat. He didn't look like a fighter, but looks can be deceiving. Murphy would go on to fight in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. His first major combat came in Sicily in 1943. That's where he started to reveal something most soldiers never find: an uncanny ability to stay calm under fire. He had a natural instinct for combat tactics and an unshakable sense of duty. He fought not for glory, but to survive and to keep his brothers in arms alive. The more battles he endured, the more his legend grew. In southern France, Murphy and his unit were ambushed by German troops. With his men pinned down, Murphy crawled forward and killed multiple enemies with grenades and rifle fire. That earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. But that was just the beginning. By the time he turned 19, he had seen more death, more blood, and more destruction than most people see in a lifetime. He had also killed more enemy combatants than many entire platoons. But the moment that cemented his place in history came in January 1945 during the Battle of Holtzwihr. It was snowing. The Germans were advancing, and Audie's company was severely outnumbered. They had just 19 men to hold off over 200 German troops, supported by 6 tanks. Things looked grim. Murphy ordered his men to retreat to a safer position, while he stayed behind to cover them. Murphy climbed aboard a burning tank destroyer, the ammunition inside still cooking from a previous hit. He manned its .50 caliber machine gun and began firing, alone, at the advancing German infantry. He stayed there for more than an hour, holding them back. When he finally ran out of ammo, he jumped off and led a counterattack with his surviving men. By the end, dozens of German soldiers were dead, and the rest had retreated. For that, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. He would go on to receive every U.S. Medal for Valor available at the time, including the Silver Star, twice, Bronze Star, twice, and the Purple Heart, 3 times. His story became known nationwide. Photos of the boyish-faced war hero were published in newspapers, Life magazine, and recruiting posters. He came home a hero, but one deeply scarred by what he'd seen. Returning to the United States in 1945, Audie was hailed as a national icon. President Harry Truman himself praised Murphy's service, but beneath the celebration was a man deeply uncomfortable with praise. He didn't see himself as a hero. In interviews, he often appeared shy and even embarrassed when journalists asked about his battlefield actions. He said many of the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Audie began to suffer from what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, it had no name and no treatment. He had nightmares. He suffered panic attacks. He drank heavily. He sometimes lashed out in fear. In one interview, he admitted to sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. In 1945, James Cagney invited Murphy to Hollywood after reading about his war exploits. At first, Audie had no interest in becoming an actor, but financial pressures and public fascination with his story pushed him into the spotlight. Murphy took acting lessons, started appearing in small roles, and eventually starred in a film based on his autobiography, To Hell and Back. That movie became a massive success and one of Universal's highest-grossing films for decades. He went on to appear in more than 40 films, mostly westerns. On screen, he was calm, stoic, and noble, the perfect image of American masculinity. Off-screen, he was introverted, private, and increasingly tormented. Murphy never fully embraced Hollywood. He was never comfortable with the attention, the interviews, or the artificial glitz of the movie world. He often said that no movie could ever capture what war was truly like. For him, pretending to be a soldier was far more painful than actually being one. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Murphy became one of the earliest public figures to speak candidly about the mental toll of war. He talked openly about the nightmares, the fear, and the guilt. This was unheard of at the time. Veterans were expected to be silent, stoic, and grateful, but Murphy refused to hide his pain. He testified before Congress on the need for better treatment for soldiers returning from Korea and Vietnam. He even refused to accept roles that glamorized war. Yet behind closed doors, his life was unraveling. He battled depression. He went through a divorce. He lost money and failed business, ventures, and gambling debts. At one point, he locked himself in a hotel room with a gun for a week while trying to withdraw from sleeping pills. Friends said he was tormented by the belief that he should have died in Europe, like so many of his brothers in arms. Despite the medals, despite the movies, despite the national acclaim, Audie Murphy was no longer the loyal soldier he once was. Over the years, he grew increasingly critical of the very system he had risked his life to defend. He called out the military's treatment of wounded veterans. He criticized the government's slow response to PTSD. He accused politicians of using soldiers for political gain while offering little support once they returned home. These weren't angry rants. Murphy rarely raised his voice, but they were pointed, clear, and impossible to ignore. Those close to him say he was tired of being used as a symbol, tired of being misunderstood, and tired of keeping secrets, and it's those secrets that may have ultimately led to his death. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a private twin-engine Aero Commander 680 Super aircraft at DeKalb Peachtree Airport in Atlanta, Georgia. He wasn't alone. 5 other men joined him: pilot Herman Butler, co-pilot Raymond Prater, and 3 business associates, including a prominent horse trainer and racing figure. The plane was bound for Martinsville, Virginia, on a short business trip that would change everything. What was so significant about this particular flight? On paper, it was routine. Audie had been involved in horse racing and business ventures, and this trip was allegedly connected to one of those enterprises. No press was alerted, and there were no interviews or plans for public appearances. This wasn't a celebrity excursion. It was quiet, private, and deliberately under the radar. What few knew was that Audie had reportedly received several anonymous threats in the months leading up to his death. Close friends recalled his increasing paranoia, his concern that people were watching him, even following him. While most chalked it up to his PTSD and public status, others now believe he was genuinely being targeted. The secrecy of that final flight would later become one of the most debated aspects of the tragedy. According to official reports, the aircraft departed around 12:08 p.m. under what pilots call instrument meteorological conditions, meaning visibility was poor and the pilots had to rely heavily on instruments. Around 1:00 p.m., as the plane approached the Blue Ridge Mountains near Catawba, Virginia, it disappeared from radar. Just a few hours later, the Civil Air Patrol began receiving concerned calls. The plane hadn't arrived and no one had heard from the passengers or crew. Search teams were scrambled, but it took 2 days to locate the crash site, deep within Brush Mountain, a heavily forested and mountainous region that was nearly inaccessible. Rescuers finally arrived. What they found was horrifying. The aircraft had struck the mountain at high speed, killing everyone on board instantly. The wreckage was so badly burned and scattered that it took significant effort to identify the victims. Among the remains, they found parts of Murphy's dog tags, confirming that America's most decorated soldier was gone. The nation went into mourning. Newspapers across the country published headlines reading, "Audie Murphy killed in plane crash." Radio broadcasts praised his heroism and legacy. The country had lost not just a war hero, but an icon of resilience, bravery, and complicated humanity. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an investigation immediately following the crash. After months of analysis, they released their final report. The cause of the accident was controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, due to poor visibility and pilot error. Essentially, they concluded that the pilot became disoriented and flew directly into the mountain. It was a neat explanation. The weather was bad. The pilot didn't see the mountain in time. Tragic, but not unusual. But even from the beginning, something felt off to aviation experts and to those who knew Audie best. For one, the aircraft was flown by an experienced pilot. Herman Butler had thousands of hours of flying experience and had piloted similar trips under worse conditions. Second, the weather was not as terrible as initially reported. Witnesses in the area described cloudy skies, yes, but not the kind of dense fog or storm activity typically associated with such a disaster. Furthermore, radar logs revealed the plane had been descending rapidly before impact, far below the altitude it should have been flying to clear the mountains. No emergency call had been made, no mechanical issue had been reported. It was as if the aircraft had simply dropped, deliberately or otherwise, into a death spiral. Audie Murphy's funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971. Thousands gathered to pay their respects. The U.S. Army rendered full honors, including a 21-gun salute and flyover by military jets. Politicians, veterans, and Hollywood figures came to mourn him. The country grieved deeply for the man who had become the face of courage during World War II. President Richard Nixon issued a statement praising Murphy's service, while newspapers ran headlines like, "Audie Murphy, hero to the end." In private, family members, particularly his widow, Pamela Archer Murphy, expressed doubts. She questioned the timing of the flight, the vague business meeting he was attending, and the fact that Audie had seemed deeply unsettled in the weeks before his death. He was acting different, she reportedly told friends. He was scared. He didn't want to go. While the official version of Audie Murphy's death paints a tidy picture of a tragic aviation accident, locals near Brush Mountain recall details that didn't match the final report. Several residents in the area reported hearing 2 loud explosions, not one, just before the crash. These were described not as mechanical failure noises, but as sharp, sudden bursts, more like detonations. Others reported seeing the plane flying unusually low even before the fatal descent. A retired farmer who lived just 3 miles from the crash site told local reporters that the aircraft wasn't struggling. It was gliding like it was coming down on purpose. His statement was quietly buried, never mentioned in the final. NTSB report. Emergency responders and investigators noted early on that the burn pattern on the fuselage suggested an explosion had occurred prior to impact, not just as a result of it. Parts of the tail section were found several hundred feet from the main crash site, which typically indicates mid-air disintegration, not impact scatter. These inconsistencies were never explained. In fact, several original photographs from the crash site reportedly went missing from the official case file. Survivors of the investigation team later admitted that some evidence was deemed too sensitive for public release, raising even more questions. At the heart of the accident was pilot Herman Butler, a man who on paper had the experience to avoid such a fatal mistake. But as journalists dug deeper, things began to surface about Butler's recent behavior. Just weeks before the crash, Butler had told a colleague he was being pressured into doing things he didn't agree with. No one knew exactly what he meant, but that same colleague testified, off the record, that Butler had seemed rattled, even frightened. Even stranger, Butler had no known connection to Audie Murphy prior to the trip. Why was he selected to pilot the aircraft? Why wasn't Murphy flying with one of his usual pilots or associates? The official explanation, that Butler was available and certified, isn't untrue, but it doesn't satisfy the deeper questions. And then there's the matter of the flight path. Several aviation experts noted that the route taken by the Aero commander on that day didn't follow standard procedure for avoiding dangerous terrain in poor weather. Why would such an experienced pilot risk flying at low altitude near mountainous regions, especially if he had passengers of Murphy's stature? Audie Murphy wasn't just a war hero. By the 1970s, he was deeply embedded in multiple worlds: Hollywood, politics, military intelligence, and private enterprise. He had worked on classified training films, consulted with U.S. military brass, and, according to some unconfirmed reports, had been involved in covert post-war intelligence operations. A declassified document from the late 1960s, released decades after his death, shows Murphy's name listed among potential informal advisors during the early stages of American counter-narcotics programs in Mexico and Central America. The same document references a high-profile civilian asset who had raised concerns about corruption and laundering within certain government channels. People close to him claim that in his final months, Murphy had grown disillusioned with several government entities. He had allegedly told one confidant that he knew too much and was worried about saying the wrong thing. Some now believe that Murphy's death was not only not accidental, it was orchestrated to ensure he stayed silent. Perhaps most troubling is the way information about Murphy's crash has vanished over the years. Critical documents that were once accessible through the Freedom of Information Act are now missing. Several audio tapes, originally recorded by NTSB investigators and made available to journalists in the 1970s, can no longer be located in federal archives. 2 individuals who claim to have seen suspicious activity near the crash site, one a forest ranger, the other a hiker, reported being interviewed by men in black suits who did not identify themselves. The ranger later told his daughter that he was told not to talk about it anymore, adding, "It wasn't just a crash. I know that now." Even more strangely, Murphy's widow, Pamela, allegedly hired a private investigator to look into the crash months after the NTSB closed the case. According to reports from family friends, the investigator's findings were troubling, but before he could present them, he died in a car accident under suspicious circumstances. In the days following Murphy's death, media outlets across the country focused on his heroic legacy, war stories, and tragic loss. Very few questioned the circumstances of the crash. And those that did, mostly independent reporters and regional columnists, found their inquiries stonewalled by official channels. A journalist from the Atlanta Constitution, who attempted to run a follow-up story on the NTSB's inconsistencies, later wrote in his memoir that the newspaper received pressure from government sources to leave the story alone. It's an eerie echo of other high-profile deaths from that era where official narratives prevailed, and dissenting voices were buried under patriotic sentiment and institutional trust. In hindsight, the question is no longer, did Audie Murphy die in a crash? It's, why has no one allowed us to ask more about it? In the final chapter, we'll explore the legacy of unanswered questions, how Audie's family and fans have kept searching for the truth, and whether the mystery may finally be on the verge of being solved, even if the answers aren't what we want to hear. In the aftermath of Audie Murphy's tragic death, his family found themselves not only in mourning, but in confusion. His widow, Pamela Murphy, who had always stood by him through his post-war traumas, Hollywood struggles, and military honors, reportedly received no answers that satisfied her. Friends say Pamela asked questions privately about the crash investigation, about Butler's choice as pilot, and about why Murphy was flying that day in the first place. But the official responses were always short and sanitized. She told one confidant that everything felt staged and that she couldn't shake the feeling something was being kept from her. Murphy's children also grew up with a heavy sense of absence, not just of their father, but of closure. His son Terry once admitted in a 1989 interview that they never really got to say goodbye because there were too many gaps, too many questions. Even more disturbing? The family tried to retrieve personal items from the crash site, including a ring Audie always wore, but some were never returned and were later discovered listed at private auctions. How could personal effects, supposedly collected during a federal investigation, end up in the hands of collectors? In the early 2000s, as new evidence about several Cold War operations began to surface through declassified files, independent researchers and military historians began revisiting Murphy's death. Some filed Freedom of Information Act requests, seeking the full, unredacted crash report. What they received back: a heavily blacked-out document citing national security exemptions. How could a civilian aircraft crash, deemed an accident, be linked to national security? This prompted a small but determined group of researchers to attempt a full re-examination. They compiled witness interviews, satellite weather data, and unreleased FAA logs. Their conclusion? There was sufficient evidence to justify a formal reopening of the investigation. But despite their efforts, their petition was rejected. The reason? The case was closed and resolved. One of the researchers, a former intelligence officer, told a podcast in 2014, "What happened to Audie Murphy wasn't random. He was still dangerous to certain people because of what he knew, and the only way to ensure silence was to bury him in a story no one would question." Perhaps the most chilling part of the story is what Audie himself may have foreseen. In letters discovered by a friend after his death, Murphy wrote about feeling increasingly unsafe, especially after speaking out about veteran mistreatment and government waste. In one letter, dated just a month before his death, he penned, "I've spent my life serving this country, but it feels like I'm being followed by shadows that don't want the light." He even reportedly warned a fellow veteran to watch his back when working with certain political figures, and spoke cryptically about secrets from his intelligence work in Europe that never should have come home. It now seems these weren't just the paranoid thoughts of a man scarred by war. They were warnings from someone who knew too much and trusted too little. Decades later, there remains a persistent theory among military circles and historians that Murphy was silenced. Some believe he was preparing to expose internal corruption linked to veterans' benefits and misallocated military funds. Others believe he had stumbled across information tied to covert drug operations that certain factions wanted hidden. But the theory that has gained the most traction is this: Audie Murphy, a decorated war hero and beloved public figure, refused to play along with the powers that once used him for morale and propaganda. And when he became inconvenient, they made sure he wouldn't speak out again. Whether or not you believe in conspiracies, one thing is undeniable. Too many questions remain unanswered, and too many details about Murphy's final moments are buried in silence. In an age of distrust and disinformation, stories like Audie Murphy's hold more weight than ever, not just because of what might have happened to him, but because of how quickly the truth can be rewritten, erased, or ignored. Murphy was a man who faced evil with courage, both on the battlefield and in life. And yet, he may have met his end, not because of who he fought, but because of what he fought against behind the scenes. If this story moved you or made you question the version of history we're often told, don't let it fade into silence. Share it, talk about it, research it. Audie Murphy gave his life to protect a nation. The least we can do is demand the truth about how that life ended. Subscribe for more long-form documentaries uncovering the truths, Hollywood, and history books. Leave out. Hit the bell so you never miss a deep dive like this one.